there was an interesting video that I wanted to take a look at, and I haven't fully watched it yet. We can talk about it, and I think it's especially fitting right now because it touches on a topic that we have talked about earlier as well already, which is it's not the exact way he words it, but the way I've been wording it is like re-evaluating your quote-unquote staples or non-engine cards or deck building choices in general. Re-evaluating these kind of choices depending on the context of the format, the deck you're playing, the role you want these cards to fulfill, and you know, maybe we can present like a little bit more of insight on when and when not to do that. The video is called "Murder Your Darlings," which I don't really understand that reference.
William Faulkner, or Ernest Hemingway, or Arthur Quiller Cooch? Jesus, it's hard to source a quote online. Is the author of the 1916 work On the Art of Writing. In what has become its most famous quote, the author professes this piece of wisdom. If you hear, I'm doing the voice because it's a quote, roll with it, require a practical rule of me, I will present you with this. Whenever you feel an impulse to perpetrate a piece of exceptionally fine writing, obey it wholeheartedly and delete it before sending your manuscript to press. Murder your darlings. This quote urges writers to reevaluate beloved, personally meaningful, and fun-to-write characters that ultimately do not serve a story. It asks authors to do the hardest thing imaginable, reconsider characters, events, and places they believe to be their best, and kill them.
The only thing I'm thinking of when he says that is Game of Thrones. Anyone else?
On an unrelated note, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is the best card in Yu-Gi-Oh! But first, this video is sponsored by HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. It takes the worst
Goodbye, Fresh.
Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is played in almost every single deck that's topped in the last 5 years of the game. It's the most played hand trap in every single Yu-Gi-Oh format where it's legal, with one exception that necessitates its use. Go to our Yu-Gi-Oh and you'll see players bemoaning it. Go to pro players' YouTubes and you'll see them calling it S tier. There's no question. If you want to win games, you'd better be playing the best. And the best is Ash Blossom. Right? Today, I want to explore an alternative understanding of the card. Like the darlings that litter the pages of Awful YA, Ash Blossom has become somewhat of a comfort character within Awful Locals lists.
So you guys are saying like, oh, where's the connection to Yu-Gi-Oh and all that? But I do think it was a solid analogy. I feel like to start us off with. I don't get the problem. Like, just because we have an intro with a quote from a different field of interest that only vaguely connects to Yu-Gi-Oh, like this was completely fine. I don't get it. I actually don't get the confusion and all that. Like fine, isn't it?
It's included within decks for a multitude of reasons. A general vague sense that it's good, a strange feeling of compulsion, a mode of thinking that because it's in so many good lists, it has to be a good card.
And all three of these reasonings, this is 100% true. All three of these reasonings, when someone presents their deck in a deck profile or even just builds their decks, right? These are not good reasonings for including a card in your deck. I mean, it's good is like the closest to an actual reasoning, but like you have to do it, you have to run it, everyone runs it, like, you know, it's a staple, this format, all these kind of things, right? People say these things very, very lightly, and they are not really reconsidering them at all. And it is true that like it is important to know when to reevaluate those things, because no matter how good Ash Blossom is, and it is a really good card, there have been times where it was not that good to play the card. And there is decks in specific formats that even when everyone else is playing Ash Blossom, they might not want to use it, right? And I'm not gonna mention Runics. I'm not gonna mention Runics.
The fact that no matter what you're playing against, it always does something. But format to format, its applications change drastically, and a must-play in one format may not serve your purposes in another. Today, I'd like us not only to examine Ash Blossom's place in the current metagame, but also to identify a thought pattern that might be hampering your success as a duelist. It's time to consider murdering our darling. Let me give you a little bit of
Dude, that
insight
sound
into the
effect is
thought
so
patterns I'm
disrespectful.
talking about. I was pawing through Runic profiles last week. If you're unfamiliar...
Okay. All right. Hey, look, how do you expect me to not mention Runics now, though? How do we, like... I did not watch until this point. I realized what the video was about, and I stopped watching before this point. I didn't know this was gonna happen. It makes it more awkward if anything. I mean, he's damn right though. Runic is like one of the best examples of when you should reconsider when to play Ash Blossom and not to play Ash Blossom. Oh, yeah.
Runic is a deck that plays on a different axis than most Yu-Gi-Oh strategies. The archetype is a series of modal spells that can function either as removal or special summon a fusion monster from your extra deck. In general, a deck that's composed entirely of 1-for-1 removal spells isn't a good call, especially when a card like Snake Eye Ash can garner 6 or 7 cards worth of advantage. However, Runic's field spell, Runic Fountain, allows you to recycle Runic spells, complicating conventional card knowledge about removal. MST isn't playable in 2024, but an MST that draws you a card, well, that's something else. Since Runic Fountain can only recycle cards a singular time, Runic decks have to guarantee they're able to find the maximum number of Runic spells in any given hand. As a result, they often max out on every Runic card with any utility whatsoever, and sometimes ones without much utility at all, just for names. The result is a deck that bucks traditional understandings of deck building, and plays a ton all but mandatory cards. Modern Runic decks, Runic Sprite Furhire, Bestial Runic, Runic Generator, and Runic Goatee have a very inflexible main deck, usually with only about 3 cards total for non-engine. And what non-engine do you think they play? In the profile I watched, they played Ash Blossom. When they revealed the card, they said, "You gotta." Why do you gotta? It makes sense on a very basic level. Ash Blossom is the most represented, and therefore the best, card in competitive play. You've got 3 spaces for non-engine. You might as well play the best possible card, but I urge you to resist that thought pattern. Instead of thinking critically about why you're playing an individual card, you're deferring to an understanding of play rates. Okay,
so the main takeaway from this, and this is also why I think, I hate to say it, but the Runic deck is a pretty good example for this, is that it is incredibly important to not only evaluate a card in the context of the overall format or the overall game, you have to evaluate it in the context of your own deck, your own strategy even, because even within the same deck archetype, like even if someone plays their Snake Eye deck, even if 2 players play a Snake Eye deck, they could maybe try to follow very different goals with their individual builds, with their individual strategy. You can drive a deck into different directions depending on the decisions you take in deck building, right? And so evaluating cards based on the context of your deck, your strategy, as opposed to evaluating them as a whole, is a very important skill set, right? And we all do this very intuitively for certain cards. For example, and I'm going to name some very, very trivial examples. People are aware that Dimension Shifter is an incredibly powerful Yu-Gi-Oh card, but you would never put it into a deck where you need your own graveyard. That does not make sense. You are, in that sense, it's a very, like I said, it's trivial, but you are reevaluating the quality of Shifter in the context of your own deck, right? And then even sometimes someone in chat is bringing up a good point. Sometimes you would. Sometimes you go further and reevaluate it again, and you're like, well, my deck needs the graveyard, but some matchups, some decks my opponent plays might need the graveyard even more. So I might still want to use Shifter, right? And that's how you saw decks like Sprite end up being a Shifter deck. How you would see decks like Pearly sometimes using Shifter, right? And it's like, that is another point where you sometimes have to go back and you need to reevaluate again. Like, okay, Shifter's a really good card. My deck doesn't really like Shifter, but it's even better against other strategies, or it hurts other strategies even more. So I'm going to go back to it maybe and try it, right? And this is all just an example of evaluating cards in the context of your own deck, right? And I mean, in the case of Shifter, it's relatively trivial, right? In the case of Ash Blossom, it becomes a lot harder, right? Because that Ash Blossom is a very generic card that could theoretically be played in almost every deck, right? Like the card is good and it can theoretically go into every deck, but should it also go into every deck in practice, right? And that is a question that is worth asking, I think. And the answer to that question is not always yes. Like, I have played and done really well at tournaments in the past couple years since Ash Blossom's release, and I have not played Ash Blossom in every single one of my decks, right? I haven't played Ash Blossom in the Runic Sprite deck that I won YCS Utrecht with. At least I don't think I did. I don't remember. I think I didn't. I think I played Lava Golems. But then I ended up and I haven't played it in a lot of my Runic decks since. But I did play it in my Runic Bestial deck for YCS Bologna. The simple reason for that is the context of the Runic decks that I've been playing was usually Runic decks are pretty good at going second by nature. Like, not insane, but they have some pretty good tools, right? The fact that you have a negate, a destruction effect, a back row removal effect, and so on and so forth. Like, they have some valuable tools for going second already, and you wanna amplify that by playing a very high impact non-engine cards because you don't have a lot of room. You don't have a lot of room for non-engine in the deck, and using your only non-engine slot on a card like Ash Blossom, which is very diverse but relatively low impact, is usually not what you want to do. The only reason why I played Ash Blossom for YCS Bologna was because basically two reasons. First of all, the format was super wide. There was a lot of different decks which called for a non-engine card that was also useful in a lot of different matchups, and there was not many options for that, right? Ash Blossom was one of the few cards that actually reasonably covered most matchups. But it was not the only reason, because had that been the only reason, I still wouldn't have played it, because even if Ash Blossom is super useful in a wide variety of matchups, it still is usually relatively low impact for those matchups, right? And so if you like, the card is consistent essentially, but it's consistently average, right? And you don't usually want that in a Runic deck. In other decks, you might want that, right? Like in Snake Eyes at the moment, Ash Blossom is very average most of the time as a hand trap, but because they are being played as a hand trap heavy pile, you want a lot of these kind of cards, right? Imperm, Veiler, Ash, Droll, they're all fine cards, but they're all like kind of average in what they do. But if you have a lot of them, then they're really good together. The reason why Ash Blossom was better at YCS Bologna was because there were some matchups where it was more than average, right? Labyrinth, Branded, mainly Rescue Ace. Like, it was one of the few hand traps that was actually good against Rescue Ace. Like, if you had Ash for Emergency, there was a decent chance they wouldn't be able to make Turbulence happen, right? All those kind of things. So that was the reasoning why I played Ash Blossom in that deck, and as opposed to, I don't think I played it in any of my other Runic variations throughout the years, on the 1.5 years or whatever that Runics are out. I haven't played Ash Blossom at a major event. I may have sided it sometimes for Branded, but I wasn't main decking it most of the time, I think. So and that goes to show that it is important to reevaluate these cards in the context of your own deck, because these were all formats where pretty much every single deck in the format was using Ash Blossom, and they were probably right to do so, to be fair. But it is important to recognize these exceptions. Like, and it is hard to an extent to find these sort of exceptions, but it is true that in Yu-Gi-Oh, for deck building, I don't believe that there is ever a rule that applies every single time. That I don't believe it exists. I haven't encountered a rule for deck building that you can just go by every single time. There is kind of like rules of thumb that is like, if you think of these most of the time, you're going to be okay. Like, your decks are not going to be bad, but in order to find the best decks, I don't think there is a rule that you can always follow, right? Like, there's solid principles and solid rules of thumbs that if you follow them, you're always going to end up with a solid deck, right? But if you're trying to find the best deck, you have to reconsider everything. Like there's nothing that applies. Even Max C isn't true. Even Max C is not true. There are decks in Master Duel that don't play Max C, and they are right to do so. It's not many, right? Max C is one of the easier auto includes most of the time. And when someone says auto include, like it applies to like 99%. But if you are in the 1% of people that don't want to play Max C, you need to be able to realize that, right? You need to be able to make that call. And if you're not able to make that call, your deck's going to be worse.
A card in completely different contexts, in completely different decks, alongside completely different main deck options. And again, the consequences for misapplying this slot are super high. This is your only piece of non-engine in the deck. It's gotta be good. Instead, I ask you to be willing to murder your darling. Enter an examination of Ash Blossom's slot with a willingness to cut it. It's very possible you'll realize that much of Ash's strength comes from its use alongside a second hand trap, and in a list with so few non-engine slots, you're better off following Dinkabui's lead and playing an equalizer that might trade for more cards. It's very possible you don't play any non-engine at all. If Ash is just going to trade for 1 point of interaction, you might as well sub it out for even more Runic spells that do the same but offer more.
Unironically, speaking of Max C and Master Duel, unironically, I've had times where, or like I've been in formats in Master Duel where everyone is playing Crossout, Called by, Ash Blossom, and maybe even Gamma to counter Max C. And there are so many times where I go second and I use a Max C, my opponent negates it anyways, and then I start my turn with one less card, and I was like, I kind of wish I didn't even have Max C in the first place. I would rather have one extra card now than having spent that Max C. So I sometimes I even feel like Max C is, I mean, it's an incredibly broken card. I don't want to say anything else, but like sometimes there's formats where I was thinking about taking it out because everyone was playing so many outs to it that I was not feeling good about it often. Because if my Max C gets negated like 60% of the time or some shit, then it doesn't feel that good to me, right? You still feel obligated to play it, and I understand that. But even that might not be a given for every single format that's still yet to happen for Master Duel.
Flexibility for your linear strategy. It's even possible you do land on Ash Blossom. Maybe your worst matchup completely folds to it, but whatever conclusions you draw, I ask you to do them without...
Brand that doesn't completely fold to Ash Blossom. According to all the brandies in my chat, they have a very easy time against Ash Blossom. They play through Ash Blossom every single time. They never lose to it. It's only a coincidence that every time that I personally Ash Blossom branded, they always pass the turn. These two things are not connected to each other.
Any presuppositions. Rather than just tossing out a "you gotta," here's an example of that thought process in action. We're considering playing Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring in our deck. Let's begin by thinking about the use cases for the card. At present, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about as close to a Tier 0 format as we have ever been. Almost any use of this card is going to be against a deck packing Snake Eyes, and probably Fire King. First up, conventional wisdom is that if you see a Fire King island, it's a pretty good target for Ash Blossom. Responding to the island with an Ash Blossom prevents the destruction of a monster, which prevents access to Runics, which prevents access to Kirin. However...
it's not a great example, I'll say that, because the Ash Blossom on island only really happens if they hard draw island, which they play one copy. Usually if they like Ash Blossom is going to be used on a different spot.
This supposes they have no other access to the Fire King line. Many of these decks are on 3 Kirin already. It's just as likely that they naturally draw a Kirin as you are to draw an Ash. Even if...
Well, I mean, Kirin doesn't play through Ash. This is not a great example. I agree with everything said until this point. This one's not a great example.
This does prevent access to the Fire King half of the deck. You've still got to deal with the Snake Eye half, upon which you did not expend an Ash Blossom, and which is strong enough to facilitate its own tiered deck. Oh, and you're down a card. Secondly, what about original Sinful Spoils? Well, this can cut off access to Ponix or to Snake Eyes, depending on which half of the deck your opponent starts with. But the deck's got at least 6 other ways to get to the Snake Eye cards, and a number of ways to get to the Fire Kings as well. Ways that are now not vulnerable to Ash Blossom. Against the Snake Eye Pure variant, this card is also often just icing. You've got to contend with Flamberge, Whale, IP, and Princess, even without the Sinful Spoils. Thirdly, how about the effects of the individual Snake Eyes monsters? These are just kind of bad card economy. As referenced earlier, Snash usually represents 6 or 7 cards on its own. You're trading a card in hand for 1/2 of this card's effects. You might expect Ashing Snash or Oak can cut off access to Flamberge, but as decks begin weaving Divine Temple into their combo lines, it is becoming ever clearer that that's also unlikely. All these use cases are fine, but hopefully...
I'm not sure how I feel about calling it Snash.
you can see that they're very often anything but turn-ending must-plays. Frequently, the card has a negligible impact on the board state. Now let's talk about the downsides to playing an Ash Blossom. Firstly, and most obviously, is Hita the Fire Charmer. Every fire deck is already playing this card. Yep. It's a way to climb through fire monsters that occasionally extends. It's a spellcaster for Selene, and importantly, it's massively punishing if you're playing Ash. In a best-case scenario where you are able to Ash Blossom and opponents must resolve effect, the monsters remaining on your opponent's side of the field can be linked into Hita, summoning your Ash Blossom back on the way to an early Promethean Princess. Secondly, if we're in a Tier 0 format, you can expect, as duelists were during the UDS Invitational, players may be playing Crossout Designator. If they're on 3 Crossout, your opponent will have just as many chances to find this card as you will to find Ash Blossom. This negates the effect of Ash Blossom, of course, but unlike its partner in Called by the Grave, it does not banish the card. As a result, an opponent who is playing this card can punish an Ash not only with their existing combo, also game-winning extension via the Hita line. Thirdly, often makes your second hand trap worse. Even in these videos I've shown you extolling the positives of Ash Blossom, the duelists let slip that it's a powerful card when it's paired with another high-impact hand trap. This makes sense. A number of formats have top decks that are incredibly resilient at playing through a single hand trap, but fold to 2 in sequence. Unfortunately, giving access to the Hita line often gives your opponent the ability to play around the second hand trap. Free extension.
This is true to an extent. I still think Ash is pretty good paired with other hand traps. So, long story short, some of these examples were good, some of these examples were not that great. But overall, it's good to... the main point of the video is reevaluate Ash Blossom even in a format like this one. That's fine. Long story short, current format Ash Blossom is quite simply not that impactful against Snake Eyes, right? Snake Eye has choke points for Ash Blossom, and I think that's why Ash Blossom specifically is so hard to evaluate, is because you never actually feel like it's bad. Ash Blossom is never dead in your hand, and that is something that players value, right? That's what people value about a card, and that it is valuable. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's not valuable. I'm just trying to explain why it's so hard to get away from playing Ash Blossom specifically. Like, that card specifically is really, really hard. Is really, really hard to get away from because of how kind of safe it feels, right? On how, like, it's a hand trap that you want to have in your deck, kind of, because you know, like, oh, how can it possibly be bad when it just hits something in every single deck? And the key thing to realize is that it's not... The argument is not that Ash Blossom is bad. The argument is Ash Blossom is maybe not powerful enough because obviously it's competing with other cards in the same slot, right? It's like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring being in your deck or in your hand doesn't mean it's not going to be a bad card. It's always going to do something, right? But it could be a different card that maybe would be doing more in this particular scenario, in this particular format, right? And like, that's the thing, right? That is the thing. And I would argue at the moment, the only reason why Ash Blossom, or the only time Ash Blossom should be in your deck for the current format, is if you are playing a super, super hand trap heavy deck. If your deck only has 3 hand traps, and the only hand trap you decide to play is Ash Blossom, that is most likely incorrect. Even if your deck has 6 hand traps or 9 hand traps, and one of them is Ash Blossom, that might just be incorrect. Because I'm gonna be honest with you, drawing 1 hand trap against Snake Eye is usually not enough, especially if it's Ash Blossom, right? I don't know what the exact break point is, right? I don't know what the exact break point is, whether it's 9 or 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever, right? I can't tell you that exact number. What I want to get across here is that Ash Blossom in this current format is only good in some contexts. And the context for Ash Blossom where it's good is if it's paired with other hand traps, which means you need to make sure that you have a good chance of drawing it with other hand traps. And that is not something you can really realistically do if you're only playing Ash or only playing some hand traps. And if you're playing a deck like, if you're playing a Runic deck right now, for example, as one deck that doesn't have room for non-engine, like statistically you can play like 3, 4, 5 non-engine cards, Ash Blossom should not be making it into any of your guys' Runic decks at the moment, I don't think. And the same is true for a lot of other decks that don't have a lot of non-engine spaces, like maybe I'm thinking like Branded, which is a deck that typically doesn't have that many non-engine cards in it, right? And if you're playing Branded, I don't think you should be playing Ash Blossom in it unless you need one for crossout, maybe, right? So, and this is all you really need to do, is like be able to sit back, look at your deck, kind of maybe like lean back, look at it from a distance, and think about, okay, what is my strategy when I play against Snake Eyes with this deck in this current format, right? Is my strategy when I go second, I want to stop them from building a board? In that case, I need a certain amount of hand traps to do that. Is my strategy I want to make them build a board and play into it? In that case, you wouldn't be playing hand traps at all. Is my plan I want to stop a very specific thing from happening? Like maybe I can deal with everything they do, but I can't deal with the Fire King cards, so I want to play cards that are good specifically against the Fire King cards. Maybe you're looking at cards like DD Crow or something like that. Get rid of that Runics or something like that. You know, like you need to reevaluate what you want your deck to do, what your game plan is, right? And that's the I guess, long story short, it wasn't that short, but yeah.
May net your opponent a Princess or even a Flamberge through Divine Temple, both of which contest an in-hand Nibiru. If it's turn 2, Hita may be the difference between a Link 3 like Celine that can demand a response with an access code threat that Princess couldn't. The knowledge that Ash Blossom is no longer in play may embolden a duelist to make the decision to commit to a high-impact Fire King Island line that loses to very little outside of Ash Blossom instead of a comparable line that loses to more generic options. Hell, maybe they can even make it to Apollosa. So, what are you gonna do? I'd like to conclude on this. I'm not asking you necessarily to kill Ash Blossom, to remove it from your decks and laugh from atop a throne of contrarianism as soon as I'm done with it. I'm asking you to consider the above discussion and determine if it's worth playing in your deck. Jesse, for instance, describes it as the 4th best hand trap, but guess what? He's playing the other 3 already. It's gonna make the cut. Rather than just putting it out to pasture or jamming it in your 55, what I'd like you to do is start engaging with your deck choices using this mental model. Interrogating every slot in your deck by examining its use cases, its downsides, and how it meshes into the larger context of the rest of your strategy. Most importantly, be ready to buck unscientific, vibes-based deck decisions like, you gotta be prepared to murder your darlings.
And I agree with this. This was good. This was a good competitive discussion, I'm gonna be honest. And it was also a good analogy in the beginning. I don't know why people why people had a problem with that. I felt like that was a nice video. And it's important on the I think this is one of the, there's a lot of things like this, but it's definitely one of the things that makes it so, like, on the journey from being, I want to say, like, let's say an average competitive Yu-Gi-Oh player to like a above average very good Yu-Gi-Oh player, these are the sort of things that you need to learn along the way, right? The ability to make these choices in the right moment, the ability to critically think about deck choices that everyone else is just making because you have to, right? Being able to break with those sort of things when it makes sense, not doing it, once again, not just doing it, like, there's people that do the opposite, right? They will not play a card because everyone is playing it just because they want to be different. That is also, you know, you need good reasoning for it, right? If your only reason to not play a card is because everyone's playing it, I mean, you can do that, but that's not, from a competitive perspective, that's not smart, right? Or like to just not play a deck because everyone is playing it, right? You don't want to play the meta, right? Which is like, I mean, it's fine, but once again, from a competitive perspective, that's not very smart. It's not very good reasoning, even though there can be instances where you don't have to play the best deck in, or the conceived best deck, right? Like, for example, I don't know, Zodiac format, everyone was playing Zodiac, and if you weren't willing to critically think of it, you wouldn't be like, hey, maybe this deck that 60% of people are using right now isn't actually that unbeatable, right? And this is how Paleo was born, right? I don't think I have as much of a chance to win YCS Prague if I enter with Zodiac, because that's what everyone was doing, right? Like you need to figure out a way to beat what everyone's doing, and it's not always possible. You don't always see me enter a tournament in a tier 0 format with a non-meta deck, right? Like for example, during tier limit format, I tried I tried doing that, and I didn't think it was worth it, and I didn't think it was possible, so I ended up playing tier limits, right? It's like you need to reevaluate these things every single time over and over and over again, and there's no easy way out as like, oh, I'm just gonna do what everyone else is doing, because if you're doing what everyone else is doing, you're also gonna perform like anyone else is performing, and that is on average not doing so well, right? Like, I mean, the average player that does what everyone is doing is usually not winning events. Like most of the time, or like not most of the time, but like a lot of the times you see someone win or top an event, like very often it'll have some innovation somewhere, right? That paleo list is one of the 3 best lists in the history of the game. What's the other 2? What are you thinking? Plants? Okay, calm down. All right, that was fun.